Hi there, listener. This is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. I'm Ian Willoughby. My guest today is somebody I've known a little for a long time. That's the leading Czech music writer, Pavel Klusák. Pavel has just seen the publication of his latest book, Suchý and Šlitr, Semafor 1959 to 1969, looking at the Semafor Theatre, which was the most significant arts institution in 1960s Czechoslovakia, ushering in a new era against the backdrop of a slow political thaw in the communist country. Semafor was centred on the songwriting duo of Jiří Suchý and Jiří Šlitr and gave starts to an entire generation of enduring pop stars. And I discuss all of this now with Pavel Klusák in this edition of Prague Talk. Pavel, you've written this wonderful new book about Jiří Suchý and Jiří Šlitr. How did their partnership first begin? How did these two guys get together?
Their story is a part of the late 50s, when, after 1956, the atmosphere, both political and social, in our country got more warm. The rigidest Stalinist times were over, but were very freshly over. So people like Jiří Suchý, and there were very few ones, wanted to amuse themselves and play music influenced by, as they say, American rhythms. Soul and rhythm and blues, early rock and roll, jazz, swing, and the jazz club Reduta was one of a very few places in Prague. Music was played mostly in cafes and hotel bars, but Jiří Suchý and the band Akor Klub played without any permission, and their long nights of dance music and very playful lyrics, because Jiří Suchý is a poet, it's clear, brought attention. Students were an audience, but actors and artists too. So one of the comedians of that time brought one night Jiří Šlitr as a composer, who saw a band playing mostly covers of American and songs from the world. So that's the moment of meeting of people who wanted to do not a local pop, not this conservative, grey and somehow very correct songs of that time, but they were ready to explode with something that probably was like a blueprint or a preview of the 60s.
You say in the book that the big influence on Suchý were Voskovec and Verich, and that Šlitr was influenced by Dixieland. At the time when they started, or when they became famous, was Dixieland still a popular form of music?
That's probably one of the cores of the story. If you say that Theatre Semafor was a huge phenomenon of the Czechoslovak 60s, you would expect pop, beat, maybe early rock. But these people had this jazz, swing, Dixieland, like post-swing band. The reason is clear. Jiří Šlitr was a teenager and a young man in a fascist or Nazi era during World War II, when people could not amuse themselves freely and jazz was forbidden. Jiří Suchý was in his 1920s during the Stalinist era, when again jazz as this Western influence was forbidden clearly. So the nation waited for a long, long time for permission to live with jazz songs, old musical entertainment and so on. Abroad, Bob Dylan started his career. The beginning of the 60s was the beginning of a British invasion, but these people and the Czechoslovakian nations too needed at last enjoy this kind of music. That's why in 56, 57, when Jiří Suchý and then along with Šlitr started, So I think that the society over here was like a pressure cooker, papinův hrnec, we would say, and they were the ones who hit the ventile, and that's why the feedback was enormous. The whole generation remembers it, and the first years of the theater Semafor was much more than good comedians' works. It was the big generation change. I am a child of a generation of parents for whom it was the significant change not just in what songs you listen and what jokes do you laugh at, but it was a permission. It was a permission to amuse yourself freely, not through a responsible satire.
So they started Semafor in 1959 after coming through some other theatres. What's really interesting to me as somebody who's not from here is I'm not sure if there's any kind of analogy to Semafor in the US or the UK. But if I understand it right, Semafor was a very popular theatre where it was very hard to get tickets, but it probably entered most people's consciousness through songs on the radio, songs from the theatre that became radio hits, and then maybe later movies like If a Thousand Clarinets. For most people, it was a radio phenomenon.
These were the early days of Czechoslovakian television, but Semafor was too risky for television. They didn't appear frequently there. So there was a legend of this small theater, and it's true that since 1960, the institutions realized there's no sense in repressing Semafor. Yes, one of the first Semafor plays was forbidden. Taková ztráta krve, such a loss of blood, because it really had a political image or content. But songs themselves were cheeky but innocent. So when one of the first songs was released as a single, Včera neděle byla, very simple song sung by the 18 years old singer Pavlína Filipovská, it became the most sold single of Czechoslovakia for 22 years. People were amazed that Semafor is not half forbidden anymore, but becomes
mainstream.
Not just mainstream, but also a signal of change, that more things are allowed.
As for Suchý and Šlitr as songwriters, how did they collaborate as songwriters? Was it simply that Šlitr did the music, Suchý did the lyrics? Did they both do both? Did they write together, separately?
People say, and it's probably right, that Jiří Šlitr, the composer, were the more ambitions of the couple. Šlitr proposed in the end of the 50s to do a private contract to collaborate just together. Suchý and Šlitr not collaborating as the songwriters with other people, but writing on and on and on together. That's probably why they knew each other more and more, better and better. And for some time, they had a rule, every week a new song. So it means that quite quickly they had amazing, large repertoire, or how to say it. And if someone would ask why so many of the songs were really good, really interesting, it's hard to tell. It's the same magic why Leonard Cohen is a genius. It's very hard to analyze it.
Still, there's one thing that I was thinking about listening to some of the songs. Is the main charm coming from the lyrics? Because for me, the music, it's fine, it's catchy, but it seems to me that the charm may lie mainly in the lyrics.
People who experienced it personally said that the main charm was on the stage. All the people were young, and Jiří Suchý belonged to the first generation of actors who did not act, who were there as themselves, as a songwriter, and a writer who writes plays, but the people were for their own personalities on stage. And this strange mix of theater and the authentic personal expression was quite strong at that time, and it was very hard to analyze it for theater critics, for example. So, yes, lyrics, and yes, Jiří Šlitr, maybe in his first period, wanted to belong to the genres of ballads and rhythm and blues and so on. But as he got a little older, his music went more and more individual.
But were the shows musicals? Were they in the style of musicals, or were they plays with musical interludes? Just so people get a clear understanding.
You mean the Semafor stuff? Basically, they had two kinds of production. Evenings that were more or less concerts. Concert with some conceptual story that goes around it. Zuzana is home alone. I don't know. And then they had theater plays. But after the band theater play, Suchý, I think he wanted to be careful, so they returned to plays, and very cruel plays and political plays, in the end of the 60s, when it was more safe again.
One thing also we should say is that Semafor wasn't just about these two guys, of course. The performers who were part of the group or who performed with Semafor, many of them were or became the biggest stars of the 1960s in this country.
Not just the 1960s. I can't realize how come that they have picked so many big stars of Czech pop music. Karel Gott, the biggest one, Eva Pilarová, Valdemar Matuška, all these names are notorious for not just Czech, but Czechoslovakian audience. Hanna Hegerová, a singer of chansons. And at that time, they were able to understand these people's personalities and write for Karel Gott something that's very for him, and so on and so on. I would like to point one short note. Suchý and Šlitr, in their beginnings, were very apolitical, but they needed to do it because the spirit of the time asked for it. During a few years, they realized that the society changed, and the Semafor of the end of the 60s was very political. Also in film, in collaboration with the writer Josef Škvorecký and Oscar-awarded Jiří Menzel and so on. So they realized that in certain times it's important not to be political, but at different times it would be a mistake to stay same, and they knew how to change themselves. That's one of great stories of Semafor for me.
Getting back to the members of the company, people like Karel Gott and so on, was it seen as a kind of springboard to success? If you were an aspiring singer in 1964 or something, were you thinking, if I can get into Semafor, I could be the next big star?
Definitely. I think that mostly in the first half of the 60s, Semafor worked as this springboard, and that is the reason why young Miloš Forman, as his first movie, he took his own camera and without any commission went to Semafor to shoot
Audition,
yeah, because he understood that this is the moment where the new generation appears, not just a generation of artists and singers, but of young people who want to take part.
You mentioned Forman, also Menzel and Škvorecký. Others were also involved with the Semafor in different ways, including Vaculík, Havel, Voskovec himself. It really was a kind of who's who of this country.
Yes, it was. You can see pictures from theater and from the early years, and the audience is this who is who. Miloš Forman with his wife, young actors, poets, and so on. I was surprised when I saw Václav Havel's texts. Havel was one of the very first people who understood that these people are not bad actors, but good authors, or how to put it. And he wasn't into musical, but he understood, Václav Havel understood that the humor of Semafor is partly absurd. And that was his thing, of course.
Jiří Šlitr died of gas poisoning around Christmas 1969. He was only 45. You say in the book that in the year 1969, the year after the Soviet invasion, Semafor was still doing pretty well. But could Semafor have continued into the 70s if he had lived, or was the writing on the wall?
That's the question, of course. Jiří Suchý, as a lyricist and poet and writer, was dependent on Czech language. But Jiří Šlitr has his two jobs. He was a visual artist, too, and a composer. It's international. That's why some people say that Jiří Šlitr was prepared to go abroad and work abroad. He was very touched and very depressed by the fact of occupation. And probably if Jiří Šlitr would go abroad, it would be the end of the Semafor. Not because Jiří Suchý would stay alone here, but because the power would shut it.
And you say also that Suchý actually was abroad at the time of the Soviet invasion, and both of them had in June 1968 signed the 2,000 words, which was a kind of manifesto or a statement written by Vaculík expressing support for the political thaw. Yeah, and that was kind of a risky move, I guess, for them.
During the Prague Spring 68, they did not consider it as a risky move. But after the beginning of the occupation, it was maximum risky moment, and they didn't know about their future. There were rumors that people who signed 2,000 will go to Siberia's camps or something like that. Menzel also was convinced that it will have very bad consequences for them. So Suchý stayed by his relatives in England or where for a short time, to understand how it will be in Czechoslovakia after the August 68.
Is there some parallel with the Beatles in the fact that you had the 10 years, your book is Semafor 59 to 69, that you had a kind of, not perfect, but you had a 10-year run in which they achieved a hell of a lot, and then it ended?
I think it's obvious that in the end of the 60s, many things went to their end, but I can't explain it rationally. Of course, there were these large geopolitical factors, but maybe things sometimes are in a kind of synchronicity, and that's it. Well, I can't explain it, and maybe I don't want. It's also a thing of dreams, poetry, and secrets.
And maybe we should also consider ourselves lucky that we had 10 years of the Beatles or 10 years of Semafor.
Yeah.
One thing also you mentioned in the book, it's kind of a side issue, though, we're here at Czech Radio, that the radio had 200 plus shows recorded, presented by Jiří Suchý in the 60s that were not preserved.
It probably says something of the atmosphere of the normalization years. Some persons in radio who wanted to make themselves safe ordered to erase a part of archive from the 60s, and at that time very few people complained, I think. And yes, Suchý wasn't considered this huge classical creative person like today, when he's 93 and alive and kicking, if I can say it this way. So, yeah. We didn't lose the texts. The texts are in the book and so on. But, it's been erased.
Well, as you say, Jiří Suchý is still on the go, and that's wonderful. Do you know him well?
I've met him repeatedly as a journalist, and during the work of a book, he helped me a lot. He shared his photographical archive with me. Thank you, fantastic. And he had some answers for me. He also told me some private stuff that is not for the book, so that I was blessed with his trust.
My final question, Pavel, is it's so many decades later, people, many generations still love these songs, still love all this stuff. What's the secret of its longevity, do you think?
When the story of Suchý and Šlitr was new, Semafor was very unifying story and legend and way of entertainment in our country. People are grateful if something can unite you with many people. I think that today my book is both for conservative part of our society and both for progressive and liberal people and also young people who are interested in a history of our pop culture. But both conservative, both progressive. It probably says you can enjoy the world, you can live as if all wars would be over. And it's not ignoring toxic view, it's a hope.
Many thanks indeed to Pavel Klusák for that insightful and illuminating interview for Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed our conversation, want to look up some of the other 100 plus earlier editions and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. But for now, that's all from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.